Hi, everyone. This is Sam Gray again. This is my Module 2 presentation. After reading our sections of reading for this module and watching the role shift video from one of the readings, I kind of broke down the 5 role shifts and decided which ones were easier for me, ones that I feel like I already do, and then which ones are more challenging, and why, basically. So ones that are a bit easier for me, it's funny because they actually kind of go hand in hand. The lecturer to facilitator and the explainer to intervener. Um, I'm pretty good at letting my students kind of go off on their own, and I'm an observer until I have to step in. And I'll just go around and kind of like listen to the learning that's going on. And for some of my students who've never really like had that experience before, it's very uncomfortable for them at first as I just kind of go up to them and like silently listen to what they're saying. And they'll stop for a second and I'll be like, no, it's fine. I'm just here to listen. And that's sometimes kind of a difficult shift for them more than it is for me. But that's one that's a little bit easier for me. And then uh, the explainer to intervener is kind of that same thing, that I'm just there until I have to step in. But I really kind of let them figure it out as much as they can first before I will jump in. And there are some cases where they'll say, like, I'll be standing next to them and they'll say, like, "Oh, Mrs. Gray, can you answer this question?" And I'm like, "Well, have you asked everybody over here first? Have you tried to figure it out first, before you ask me?" So, some of my students call it my ask 3 before me rule. But I mean, I feel like that's part of their job as a student, is to try and use their resources and their peers as much as they can before they come to me. The more challenging role shifts for me, I think the most challenging one for me is probably the fixed grouping to the dynamic grouping. Um, my classes are already grouped, or all of our 8th grade level English courses are all grouped, an above level, an on level, and a below level. But within those classes, we all know that it's not possible for it to be 100% accurate. And we also know from our experience and from this reading that sometimes we have a student who's above level in their testing or whatever data we use to track them. And then maybe they're below level on a certain concept. So we know that even within a class that's already been grouped, they're not always that accurate. But this is something that I struggle with a little bit, trying to figure out how I can group students. And the one thing that I always run into is I get nervous putting students together who I know do a lot of work and go above and beyond, and putting them with students who struggle to get their work done, because I don't want that um, responsibility to be put on a couple of students and not everybody. So that's something that I hopefully will learn a little bit more about, excuse me, in this course, but definitely something that I struggle with a little bit. The content to content skills and mindset shift. I didn't know which category to put this in, but I decided to put it in more challenging, because I feel like there are times when I really do focus on content skills and mindset as opposed to just content. But the reason that I ended up putting it in more challenging is because the teacher who was talking about this shift said that he knows teachers who do it sometimes, but don't do it all the time and don't do it explicitly. So I felt like I was more on that sometimes side. So I decided to go with more challenging. So it is a shift that I'd like to make, and that I'd like to learn more about in this course. And then generalist to specialist. This one kind of struck me a little bit as idealistic. Um, I'm just thinking about like how this could apply in my school. Not that I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a really good idea. I just don't know that it is plausible for maybe the type of setting that I'm in. I don't know that we could just afford to change our teachers and say, okay, well, so for example, I am the teacher that they talked about that said, like, is really kind of over the top and likes, like the acting kind of role of teaching. I don't know that I would be in a position to take other teachers' kids or take more students than I already have so that another teacher could lesson plan, even if that's their specialty. So I don't know. I like the idea. I just don't see necessarily how it would play out. Um, so that's why I put it in the more challenging section. As far as the important competencies, skills, and concepts from the INACOL standards, as well as the reading, I came up with 6 that either I thought were really important and I already do, or I think are really important that I'd like to build on. So this first one is definitely hands down one that I need to work on and that I'd like to improve. This is one of my weaknesses. And it was to maintain and model persistence, confidence, and optimism to resolve issues. I am sure I am not the only person who has said many expletives in their head, of course, as technology is not working. Um, and there have been many a frustrated time that I just have not modeled persistence or confidence or optimism and tried to resolve those issues. And instead, I've just gotten frustrated. Um, and been like, oh, this is so stupid, like, oh, this internet sucks, whatever. And then I see my students doing it and I get embarrassed because I'm like, oh, well, that's not at all how you should behave. Because we're lucky to even have these resources. So definitely something I want to work on and that I think is so important. Establish and maintain open communication channels online and in person with students, educators, and other stakeholders to support student learning. Very important and something that I think is one of my strengths. I am constantly communicating with my students or their families or my coworkers or my department lead or my administration. Like I am constantly communicating with them, probably to a fault. My husband probably hates it. My coworkers and administration probably hate it, but I am constantly trying to keep those lines of communication open because I think it cuts down on the amount of problems that we have in the long run. So really, really critical skill. Create ways to move ownership and analysis of data to students to promote independent learning. This is something that's challenging, but I think is really vital in getting students engaged with their learning. Beyond them just being able to see a grade, they also need to understand that like they are actually making growth, and they're actually mastering something. So for English, programs like No Red Ink are good because they show mastery and they don't let a student move on until they've mastered a topic. So while it's frustrating during the time where they're not mastering it, it's also really, really great when they do master it because they have a sense of accomplishment. Another example of how I try to do this in my classroom is we take CDT tests in our school, classroom diagnostic tools to try to basically figure out like where students are with different standards. I show my students their scores at the beginning of the year when we take them, and then I show them at our second benchmark, which is halfway through, and I actually show them like, okay, here's where your first test was, here's where your second test was. You grew 300 points, or you dropped 100 points, because it puts the ball in their court then, and I can say like, wow, what you've been doing, fantastic, this is awesome. Or it allows me to come back and say, you dropped 100 points after 4.5 months of content. So let's figure out why. Is it really because you're not getting the content? Or is it because, you didn't take the test seriously or what have you? But it really gives them ownership, and it makes them think about their thinking. Lots of metacognition there. Successful blended teaching will require taking risks, failing at times, learning to recover, and making improvements after failure. This kind of goes hand in hand with the first quality or skill that I brought up. I am a perfectionist. I do not fail well. And it is a skill that I work on regularly and that I work on with my students. We have fail tickets in my classroom where when we screw something up but we learn something about it or learn something from it, we kind of like write it down on a little piece of paper, and then I have like a fail forward wall, and they can write down, ways that they failed and how they will improve. That's exactly what blended learning takes. My blended learning classroom in year 5 looks so much different than my blended learning classroom in year 1. And it's because I failed over and over again. This is also a really good opportunity for us to include our students in their learning, because I can ask them if they liked, a station rotation that we did, or a tool that we used, or something like that. And they can tell me, and they will tell me when they do not like it or when they really do. They do not like Edpuzzle. They do like Nearpod, but only when we play games. So I get that information from them, and it involves them in the learning as well. And then successful blended learning environments often involve a shift from teacher-led to more student-centered instruction, which we all know, and this is not the first time that we've heard this. Blended learning or not, student-centered learning is what I don't know. I don't know any school that isn't focused on student-centered learning. So this isn't specifically exclusive to blended learning, but it is critical to have a successful blended learning classroom, because it is about giving up some of that control and putting it in the students' hands. And then finally, embrace change and model this for others. Something I need to work on. I definitely need to embrace change and have some more flexibility when things don't work, and let go of the reins a little bit. As far as constraints, the 3 that I've run into the most are time, curriculum needs, and changes. My curriculum changes every single year. This is my 5th year. I've taught a different curriculum every single year, even though I've taught the same grade and the same course. So curriculum changes and curriculum needs, and time constraints because of that can make implementing a blended learning classroom difficult. Resources. Sometimes your internet doesn't work, and sometimes students smash gummy bears in their computers, and then their devices don't work, and you have to fly by the seat of your pants because you don't know when Joey is going to smash gummy bears in his computer. So you really have to be flexible and have a plan B. And then support. This is not necessarily, at least on my end, like school support or admin support, because my school is very much into blended learning and very much encourages it. It's more home and student support. Sometimes the kids just don't want to be on their computers. They don't want to be on their devices. And sometimes their parents don't want them on their computers and devices. So that can be challenging. And again, you just always have to have a backup and have another option for them.